terms of my aspirations for the rest of my career and the rest of my life, I am still hoping to finish a number of projects, old projects that have been dragging on for many years. I mentioned earlier that we have launched this inter-university center at Sungkyunkwan University for the advanced study of academic Korean. I hope to continue advocacy and fundraising for that project as well as for the Korean Language Village. So lots of work to do, lots of money to be raised for both of those projects. And I want to finish some of these web-based learning resources for advanced students of Korean, including the Hanja course I talked about, but also a course I've been working on for 30 years now on Korean modern short fiction and learning modern literary Korean through short stories. We have a website now for that, although it's been very frustrating in recent years with permissions and copyright permissions from Korean authors or their children if they're deceased. Korean authors and their descendants have become very, I think, unrealistically greedy in terms of what they think they can demand from people for rights and permissions. And this is, after all, for educational purposes, so we've had trouble getting permissions, but I will continue working on that. I have been working for many, many years, 25 years at least, on a major kind of annotated translation of the Samgang Hengshildo, a very important 15th century Middle Korean text, the work on which is very advanced but not quite finished. I said earlier that I'm really not very optimistic about the employment prospects of students doing PhDs in Korean language and linguistics, but if the right kind of person came along in the next 3 or 4 years, I might be persuaded to take another student, especially if it was someone who knew Russian, who also knew Korean well, ideally someone who knew even Koryo-mal or grew up in an environment where they heard Koryo-mal before. I think it's unfortunate that we now have so many young Koryo Saram, 4th and 5th generation perhaps by now, who are learning Korean, which of course is great, but who rarely ever think to, once they've learned Korean to a high level, rarely think about using it for academic or research purposes. To a certain extent it's understandable, because even in the former Soviet Union, or especially in the former Soviet Union, job prospects in academia are not particularly attractive. But if the right person came along, they might actually have good prospects outside of the former Soviet Union if they had the right skill set. So I have always hoped or wished someone would come along that could work with me and on some of these many materials that I've collected, and which I'm really not capable of doing all by myself. I just don't have the time. So that would be interesting if some young, ambitious Koryo Saram researcher were to come along and want to work on things like that. I'm really hoping to do something with all of the textbooks that were published in the Russian Far East in the 1920s and 1930s, the language textbooks, probably maybe 3 dozen or so, a little more, 40 or so titles that I've managed to collect, and those are very interesting for many different purposes. And then I have another unfinished project related to Russia, which is about the very first professor of Korean in a Western country, was of course Grigory Podstavin, a Grigory Vladimirovich Podstavin, and I've managed to collect virtually everything that I know exists in the way of his teaching materials and his archival materials, and have drafted a monograph, but again haven't finished it. And in fact, one of his daughters died in Vancouver in the 1980s. Yeah, two other daughters died in San Francisco, one in Australia and one in Japan. So he's someone I'm interested in, and that's a project I need to finish. So really, I feel like I'm moving into this phase of my life where I really need to stop taking on new projects and just go back and finish these things I committed to decades ago. But have just been too busy because of administration and other projects to finish. And then it's kind of I know I just said I shouldn't get involved in new projects, but one thing that fascinates me, and which came to fascinate me during the pandemic, is Mayan writing, the writing of classic Maya inscriptions, which it turns out is typologically rather similar to the way that ancient Japan and ancient Korea used Chinese characters to record ancient Korean and ancient Japanese. And so, and the decipherment of Mayan has reached a stage now where it's actually possible to do comparative research, and it's also possible to go to Guatemala or Mexico or I guess parts of Honduras and actually learn a spoken Mayan language. And so maybe a project during retirement would be to spend some time learning a modern spoken Mayan language, but also learning a bit more about the writing system of classic Maya. Is sort of a bucket list project that I have. And then one other bucket list project I have involves Vietnam. And many years ago in graduate school I did study Vietnamese for 2 years. And Vietnam, of course, belonged to the Sinographic sphere. Now it's always classified as Southeast Asia, but in reality, culturally, historically, it belonged to East Asia, and of course, they learned Hanmun and so on. And I'm very interested in some of the interesting parallels between pre-modern Korea and pre-modern Vietnam. And in fact, now in Korea, there's a great deal of really interesting research being done by Korean scholars on pre-modern Vietnamese sources. So that's of interest to me as well. I just have to try to be disciplined and not get too distracted by some of these projects. Do you have any questions, Gary?
Actually, you mentioned already your wish that it will be great if somebody from talented Korea Saram students will, and any plans to visit Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan?
Not in the immediate future. Like I said earlier, I just don't think that there's I don't think there's much more that I can usefully do in terms of field work or finding new, informants to interview. And I already have so much in the way of recordings that I haven't even gone back and transcribed that I just can't. It's hard to justify a trip for research purposes, and I don't have the funding anyway, the research funding. I would certainly love to go to visit Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara, etc. in Uzbekistan, now that I've heard so many really positive reports about how well developed it is, as a tourist destination now. And I would still be interested to go, but really not so much for research purposes. I just have too much already that I'm neglecting sitting on my desk in Vancouver.
Do you think that that some talented student can appear in Canada and North America or in other countries or even in Korea which will be interested in Korean studies?
I do, and I've a couple have appeared, but for various reasons did not decide to commit to a PhD, and because it's a big decision, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time out of your life to commit to a research project like that, and as I say, the job prospects are just not that good unless the student is really extremely talented and willing to essentially take whatever fate throws at them, because once you finish your PhD, there's just no way to know what will happen. You might not get an academic position, or you might, but it might not be in a good place, or you might not enjoy it. So it's very difficult. I cannot in good conscience recommend this to most students. There has to be a student who just is so committed to this and so very much wants to do this personally that the student really doesn't care what the consequences would be after. It's at least a 5 or 6 year commitment in North America if you're going to do a PhD, and that costs a lot of money. There has to be funding. There's very little funding for Korean studies PhDs in North America. So yeah, there are such people. I have seen such students. 1 or 2 have worked with me before at the MA level, but not for PhD. I met a really interesting Russian student just last week studying here in Korea who thinks she might want to apply for the PhD, and that's certainly, I'm always interested in seeing those applications, but there's just no guarantee that they will be accepted, and I'm not the only person who makes those decisions. So it's really not that easy. So it has to be a very determined and very talented and potentially also very well funded person, whether it's personal funds or whether they're very good at getting scholarships, etc. There's so many boxes that need to be ticked for everything to actually work. And the reality is that most people in the world don't care about Korean. Most people in the world don't care about Soviet Koreans. It has a small niche inside Korean studies where it's, okay, that's interesting to some people, but it's not the kind of thing that will get you a job as a specialist in Korean studies necessarily. You have to be much more broadly trained in addition to the Koryo Saram stuff. So you need to know Korean history or literature. You have to have a bigger field of expertise within which the Koryo Saram studies somehow fits.
Yeah. There is one problem of our department for the Far Eastern Studies, which consists now from 2 parts. One is Korean studies, and another is Japanese studies. And every year, our students have to write these thesis. It's like kursavaya. Yeah, it means a final report for the for a year, or diploma. And I realized that the list of the topic recommended to diploma thesis is short, and this list is repeating the topic of previous years. Yeah, but I suppose there are lacunas and blank spaces in Korean linguistics.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not in linguistics. We have 2 majors in Oriental studies, including Korean studies. One major is Oriental studies. This is more oriented to history, political issues, international relations, economy, and so on. And second is linguistics. So in our case, it's Korean linguistics. Do you think what topics can be perspective for our students to cover these blank spaces? I mean, not as research, but just to evoke interest for this topic.
Well, I mean, there's a couple different ways to answer that. I tend to think of it in terms of the question of comparative advantage. So, so the question then ultimately is, if a student from Kazakhstan who knows Korean but also knows Russian and presumably Kazakh, what is their comparative advantage compared to their peers studying in Germany or in Canada? And the simple answer is that they know Russian. And if you look at what gets published in English and in other European languages besides Russian, there is very little that somehow brings together Russia or Russian language materials and Korea. There's very little. That's true of history. And within history, there's lots of really interesting topics, starting with the 1890s. But I think the big lacuna that I think cries out for treatment is the 1950s, the origins of the North Korean regime, North Korean-Soviet relations during the Cold War, during the Korean War. There's lots of really interesting material which, if you know Russian and if you know Korean, you can say something useful and different and new. And there's just not much out there. And that includes cultural relations, it includes international relations, diplomacy, history, you name it. And you yourself in your research on the Soviet Koreans in the 1950s, have opened doors to any number of topics, I think, that if students wanted to, they could pursue. And then definitely they have a comparative advantage, because nobody in North America reads Russian. And very few in Europe. It's just not a language that anybody's learning anymore for research. So that's one thing. I think that, and probably your students in Kazakhstan don't even realize what an advantage that is. I don't think it even occurs to them. And plus they have access to archives and materials there that of course are unique. Of course, also research on the Koryo-saram. There's still tons of things to do, especially if it's connected in a more theoretical way or with bigger questions of diaspora, which of course is a very hot topic. And basically migration is a huge popular topic now worldwide in academia. And if you find ways to connect the experience of the Koryo-saram with hot topics, hot methodological and theoretical issues in migration studies and in transnational kinds of studies, again, and all of the Koryo-saram now in Korea, that's a really interesting topic. And that's something where, again, your students or students from Kazakhstan could easily make interesting contributions because they know that some of these people that are now in South Korea and are part of this, this phenomenon. So I think there's plenty of things they can do. I guess the key is just to not be sucked into South Korean ways of looking at it, because those always tend to be dictated by very particular nationalist kind of South Korean, I guess, agendas.